There's a version of Princess Diana that the world agreed upon a long time ago. The fairy tale bride, the people's princess, the young mother in the minefield, the woman in the hospital shaking hands without gloves, the icon who danced at the White House and cried in front of a television camera with a kind of honesty that the British royal family had never permitted before. That version is real, but it is also incomplete. Because one of the most important things Diana ever did, she did quietly, alone, at a mahogany desk in Kensington Palace, with a pen and a stack of legal documents. And what she wrote there has been reshaping the world ever since. This is the story of Diana's will, who she trusted, what she actually left behind, and why the choices she made in that document were, in many ways, the most radical act of her life. To understand why Diana's will matters so much, you have to understand what the years leading up to it had cost her. By the mid-1990s, Diana had been through a kind of sustained institutional dismantling that few people in public life have ever survived with their sense of self intact. Her marriage to Prince Charles had collapsed in the most public way imaginable. The 1992 Camillagate recordings, the formal separation, the 1995 Panorama interview in which she told Martin Bashir, with quiet ferocity, that there were 3 of us in the marriage. All of it had stripped away the carefully maintained fiction of the fairy tale. The palace had responded by doing what royal institutions do when they feel threatened. They closed ranks, they managed information, and they waited for the trouble to pass. But Diana did not pass. She became, if anything, more present, more visible, and more consequential after the marriage fell apart than she had been inside it. Her charity work accelerated. Her 1997 campaign against anti-personnel landmines, which took her to Angola and Bosnia and put her in front of cameras walking through minefields in a protective visor, helped shift international political opinion in ways that professional diplomats had failed to achieve for years. The Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel mines was signed later that same year, in December 1997, 4 months after her death. Her earlier work with AIDS patients, her willingness to shake hands and sit with people at a time when the public still feared casual transmission, had helped change the social conversation around the disease in Britain and beyond. She was, in short, not a woman who accepted powerlessness. And when it came time to decide what would happen to her estate, she approached that task with the same deliberate, unconventional intelligence that had defined everything she had done since she found her voice. Diana signed her last will and testament in June 1993, updated it in 1996 after her divorce was finalized, and by the time she died in Paris on the 31st of August, 1997, her estate was valued at approximately £21 million. That figure included proceeds from her divorce settlement with Prince Charles, the sale of personal jewelry, book deals, and the ongoing value of assets tied to her name and image. The will divided that estate in a way that surprised almost everyone who expected a conventional royal document. The bulk of it, the clear majority, was directed toward charitable causes that Diana had supported personally during her lifetime. This was not the quiet, arm's-length philanthropy of institutional royalty. These were causes she had walked into personally: HIV and AIDS charities, organizations working with landmine survivors, children's hospices, and homeless shelters. The Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, established in the weeks after her death, eventually distributed over £100 million to charitable causes in the years that followed, much of it in continuation of the priorities she had outlined. Her sons, William and Harry, were provided for through trusts, with a specific structure to provide financial independence as they reached adulthood. These trusts were carefully designed, not simply a transfer of assets, but a deliberate attempt to ensure that her boys would have resources that were genuinely theirs, insulated as much as possible from the institutional machinery of the royal family. But the decision that sent a tremor through Buckingham Palace, through the legal community, and eventually through the tabloid press, was this: Diana named Paul Burrell as the executor of her estate. Paul Burrell had worked for Diana for 10 years, first as a footman to the Queen and then, from 1987, as Diana's personal butler. He was, by every account, her most trusted domestic confidant. He knew where things were kept. He knew her routines, her fears, her private correspondences. He had been present during some of the worst moments of her marriage and some of the most quietly human moments of her solitude. Diana reportedly referred to him as "my rock." Naming him executor was not a sentimental gesture. It was a strategic one. An executor has real power. They are the person who controls the practical reality of what happens to an estate, which assets are sold and when, how charitable distributions are handled, which personal items go where, and who gets access to what. By placing that authority in the hands of Burrell rather than in the hands of a palace-appointed solicitor or member of the royal household, Diana was ensuring that the management of her legacy would remain outside the direct influence of the institution she had spent the better part of a decade fighting. The palace was, by multiple accounts, deeply uncomfortable with this arrangement. Burrell was not a member of the aristocracy. He was not a lawyer. He was not connected to the network of advisors and intermediaries through whom the royal family typically managed sensitive matters. He was a butler, someone the establishment had never imagined would find himself in control of a royal estate. That, almost certainly, was the point. For several years after Diana's death, Burrell fulfilled his role as executor in ways that kept Diana's memory visible and alive in the public consciousness. Her personal possessions, her dresses, her letters, items of jewelry, were handled carefully, with an eye toward preserving their significance rather than simply liquidating them. Some items were sold at auction, raising money for the charitable causes she had cared about. Others were retained, catalogued, described. In 2002, Paul Burrell was arrested and charged with stealing 310 items belonging to Diana's estate, including personal letters, dresses, and other possessions. The case went to trial and attracted enormous press attention, in part because Burrell was expected to testify about his relationship with Diana, her private communications, and the inner workings of her final years. The trial collapsed dramatically when it emerged that Burrell had, years earlier, told the Queen that he had taken items from Diana's home for safekeeping, a disclosure that the prosecution had apparently not been made aware of. He was acquitted. What the trial revealed, even in its incomplete form, was the extent of what Burrell actually knew. He had access to letters between Diana and members of the royal family, correspondence with friends and with men she had been close to, and documents that touched on some of the most sensitive episodes of her private life. His 2003 memoir, A Royal Duty, drew on this knowledge and provided a portrait of Diana's interior life that no one else could have written. The book was a sensation. It was also, depending on where you stood, either a faithful act of preservation or profound breach of trust. Prince William and Prince Harry responded to the book with public statements condemning it as a betrayal. Charles reportedly found it deeply objectionable. The palace characterized Burrell's disclosures as a violation of the privacy Diana deserved in death. But there is another way to read it. Diana, who had given the most famous self-disclosing interview in the history of the British monarchy, who had written her own memoir material through the journalist Andrew Morton in 1992, a book that was itself published only after her death, since Diana had provided the material secretly, was not, in life, someone who believed that royal privacy should always win. She had chosen Burrell precisely because he would not be controlled. Whether Burrell's book was what she would have wanted is impossible to know. But the choice she made in her will had consequences, and she would have understood that. For William and Harry, the mother's will was not simply a legal document. It was, in a sense, the last direct communication they received from her about what she valued and how she hoped they would live. The trusts she established were designed to come into effect as they reached adulthood, providing financial independence that did not depend on the crown or on the goodwill of the institution they were born into. Diana had seen, more clearly than almost anyone, the way that financial dependency on the royal apparatus could function as a form of control. She had experienced that control herself. Her will was, among other things, an attempt to ensure her sons would not be entirely subject to it. Harry's eventual departure from the royal family, his marriage to Meghan Markle, his relocation to the United States, his 2023 memoir Spare. These events are not, of course, simply a consequence of anything in Diana's will. They reflect his own choices, his own marriage, his own experience of the institution. But the financial independence that Diana's estate provided was a real factor in his ability to make those choices. He said so himself. The trust she left gave him options that other members of the royal family, entirely dependent on the sovereign grant and the goodwill of the palace, do not have. William's relationship to his mother's legacy has been different in character, but no less profound. His dedication to mental health advocacy, his championing of what became the Heads Together campaign alongside Harry and Catherine, reflects the influence of a mother who had spoken publicly about her own mental health struggles at a time when doing so was almost unthinkably unusual for a public figure of his stature. The Diana Award, established in her name to recognize young people who contribute to positive social change, continues to operate as one of the most active legacy organizations connected to her. The Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, was established within days of her death in response to an extraordinary outpouring of public donations. At its peak, it was one of the largest charitable organizations in Britain, distributing grants to causes connected to Diana's interests: landmines, HIV and AIDS, homelessness, children in extreme poverty. The fund's most significant legacy contribution was to the international campaign to ban landmines, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in October 1997, just weeks after Diana's death. The fund also became one of the major funders of organizations working on HIV and AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, contributing to the broader international effort that eventually fed into the United States government's PEPFAR program, launched in 2003, which has since saved millions of lives. The fund was eventually wound down in 2012, having distributed the bulk of its resources. But the causes it supported, and the international attention Diana had brought to them during her lifetime, left a measurable mark on global health and humanitarian policy. Here is what is easy to miss when you tell the story of Princess Diana as well as a story about money, or a story about Burrell, or a story about the tensions within the royal family. The will was a philosophical statement. Diana could have left her estate in ways that would have minimized controversy, smoothed institutional feathers, and allowed the palace to quietly absorb her legacy into the broader royal narrative. She could have appointed a palace solicitor as executor. She could have left her charitable donations in the hands of established royal patronages. She could have structured her sons' inheritances in ways that tied them more tightly to the existing royal financial architecture. She did none of those things. She chose a person the establishment would never have chosen. She directed her resources toward the causes she had championed publicly and personally, not toward the ones the institution approved of. She structured her sons' finances in a way that prioritized their independence over their integration. She made choices that were, from the perspective of institutional preservation, deeply inconvenient. And she did all of this not in anger, not in the heat of the 1992 separation or the 1995 Panorama interview, but 3 years later, in 1996, when the divorce was finalized and she had time to think clearly and deliberately about what she wanted to leave behind. This was not an impulsive document. It was a considered one. That is what makes it remarkable. Not the money, not the specific bequests, but the fact that a woman who had spent much of her adult life having her choices made for her, her movements monitored, her words managed, her image controlled, chose, at the last moment available to her, to make the most consequential choices entirely for herself. Princess Diana died on the 31st of August, 1997. She was 36 years old. In the nearly 3 decades since her death,